There's a moment you might recognize. It's not in the middle of the night, not during some dramatic breakdown with tears and chaos. It's in the morning, on a random Tuesday, and for just a second, you're simply someone waking up, weightless. Then everything crashes back down. Work, messages, the bill that's due. And right in the middle of all that, a thought cuts through your mind. Fast, almost embarrassed. What if I just disappeared? Not in a dramatic way, just vanished. You don't really know what from. You just know that something inside you wants out. If you've ever felt that, this video was made for you. What you're carrying doesn't have an easy diagnosis. It's a kind of exhaustion that builds up in layers, not from one enormous thing, but from 1,000 small ones that together form a weight you only notice when you can no longer pretend you're not holding it. Your life might not even be bad, but something just doesn't add up. And that feeling has 3,000 years of history behind it. Picture a warrior. Not a movie warrior. No shining armor, no cinematic score. A man who spent his entire life trained for one thing only: to fight. From childhood, he learned that his honor lived in his skill, that his worth was measured in courage, that his family and his tradition depended on the role he carried. He built everything around that. Then the day of the most important battle of his life arrived. The field stretched out before him. The armies were in position. The moment his entire existence had been preparing for. And this man, Arjuna, looked out across the field and saw faces he knew. Teachers, cousins, childhood friends. People who, according to the rules of the game he had been placed in, he was supposed to face. And Arjuna did something no warrior was supposed to do. He stopped. He dropped his bow, sat down on the floor of the war chariot. His knees gave out, and he fell apart. Not in pieces, but in a quiet, complete way. Like a structure that had held its facade together for too long and finally decided to be honest about its own limits. That moment is recorded at the opening of the Bhagavad Gita, one of humanity's oldest sacred texts, part of the Hindu tradition, written more than 3 millennia ago in India. And it does not begin with wisdom. It does not begin with answers. It begins with a man sitting on the floor of a battlefield, a bow in his lap saying he can't go on. This impulse to drop everything didn't begin with the modern age. It didn't begin with social media, with burnout, or with any recent label the market invented to describe today's collective unease. It's ancient, human, universal. It shows up in the oldest texts humanity ever produced, because it has always been part of the experience of being alive and conscious in a world that demands too much from you. Arjuna wasn't only fighting a battle of swords and armies. On the inside, he was caught in the same conflict every conscious human being faces at some point. The clash between what he was taught to be and what he felt he truly was. Between the role he was handed and the person he wished he could be. And his collapse wasn't weakness. It was the moment when the self spoke louder than duty. But there's something about this story that hasn't been said yet. Something Arjuna heard when he stopped. Something you might be able to hear too, if you can do the same. Alan Watts was born in England in 1915 and spent his entire life doing something very few people have the gift to do. Taking ideas from the East that would normally take decades to absorb inside a monastery and turning them into something you can feel in the middle of a walk. Watts wrote and spoke like someone sitting right beside you, not like someone on a stage giving a lecture. He didn't want to impress you with what he knew. He wanted you to walk away different from how you came. And he said something nobody wanted to hear, but everyone needed. The modern human being lives at war with themselves. Not because they're evil or weak, but because they were taught, and from a very early age, that there is a version of themselves they should be, and that the current version never quite measures up. For as long as you can remember, there's been a voice in your head that compares. It compares what you did to what you should have done. what you are to what you could be, what you have to what you still don't have. That voice never rests. It doesn't take weekends off, doesn't respect holidays. It's so constant that you stop noticing it's there. You only feel the outcome, a background tension that never fully goes away, a low hum that drains energy without you being able to trace the source. Think about yesterday. How many times did you do something and, in the middle of doing it, you were already judging whether you were doing it right? How many times were you in a conversation, but half your attention was grading how you were coming across in that conversation? How many times did you actually rest, without guilt, without the feeling that you should have been more productive with that time? Watts called this the conflict between what is and what should be. And he said it plainly. This conflict is not natural. It wasn't born with you. It was built, taught, installed layer by layer before you were old enough to question what was being placed inside you. By the family that had expectations. By the school that ranked you. By the marketplace that turns everything into performance. That installation goes so deep that most people never stop to ask. This voice that's constantly evaluating me, where did it come from? Is it mine? Or is it someone I absorbed so early that I can no longer tell the difference? So when the urge to disappear hits, to drop everything, vanish, start over with a new name in a new place, what's crying out for help isn't necessarily your life. It's the ego. It's the part of you that was trained to perform, to produce, to earn approval. And that part, every now and then, simply can't take it anymore. I'm not saying that's easy to hear, but naming what's happening is the first step toward not being consumed by it. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who lived from 1875 to 1961 and spent his entire life doing something most people don't have the courage to do. Entering the darkness of the human interior without a flashlight that was quite bright enough. Jung didn't want to illuminate everything, and he wanted to understand what lived down there. The dreams that keep coming back, the patterns that repeat without asking permission, the fears that show up uninvited. And one of the things Jung observed with clarity is that all of us wear a mask. Not metaphorically, structurally. He called it the persona, the Latin word that Greek actors used to describe the mask they put on before stepping on stage. You have one for work, another for home, another for strangers. Each one adjusted to the environment, calibrated by what you learned that environment will accept. Each one containing real parts of you, but none of them being all of you. The problem isn't wearing the mask. That's human. It's social. It's necessary. The problem begins when you forget it's there. When it gets so fused to your face that you can no longer tell where the role ends and the person begins. Think about how many times you've caught yourself doing something not because you wanted to, but because it was what the situation expected from you. Agreeing instead of pushing back because it wasn't the right moment. Smiling because the room called for lightness. Faking interest because being honest would have been inconvenient. Each one of those small betrayals of yourself feels so minor it seems irrelevant. But they pile up, and the cost isn't financial. It's energy. It's the wear of a performance that has no scheduled closing time. A huge part of the exhaustion you feel comes from exactly this. The continuous, unconscious effort to sustain a version of yourself that isn't entirely yours. You smile when you're drained, agree when you disagree, show up when you want to disappear. Not out of bad faith, but because at some point you learned that certain versions of you were more accepted than others. And I understand this might feel heavy right now, but the urge to drop everything might not be a desire to abandon your life. It might be a very specific desire to drop the mask, to stop sustaining a version of yourself that has cost more than you calculated when you started building it. Before going further, it's worth understanding how these three voices fit together, not as references thrown in at random, but as different angles on the same phenomenon. Jung looks inward. He goes deep into the interior of your mind and shows what's happening down below. The masks, the repeating patterns, the fears with an unconscious home address. Watts looks outward. He pulls the frame wide and shows the whole system. The culture that built the expectations you're now trying to live up to. The structural logic that manufactures your exhaustion as if it were a natural byproduct of progress. And the Bhagavad Gita looks beyond. It doesn't ask what you're feeling or why society hurt you. It asks the deepest question. Who is the self behind all of this? What's left when you strip away every mask? The three complete each other. One shows what's happening inside the house. Another shows why the house was built that way. The third asks who you were before any house existed. And together, they form a map. Not a map for escape. A map for arriving somewhere you've never been. But that has always existed. You didn't get here alone. And when I say here, I don't mean this video. I mean this state. This nameless suffocation. This undiagnosed exhaustion. You didn't invent it. You inherited it. And part of what needs to be said before anything else is that the burnout you feel isn't only yours. It was built, taught, and passed down from generation to generation as if it were a natural consequence of existing in a complex world. Watts was direct about this. Western civilization taught human beings to live toward a future that never arrives. To postpone real existence in the name of a goal that's always one step ahead. You study to work. You work to pay the bills. You pay the bills to have stability. You have stability to plan for retirement. You retire to finally rest. And then what? Then you rest in a body that spent decades being ignored, or with dreams that kept getting postponed until they became that vague memory of something you'd meant to try. That's the structural logic of a civilization that confuses movement with life, that teaches implicitly that to exist is to be productive, that you need to earn your own silence. That piece comes later, always after one more thing. And what that logic produces in everyday life isn't abstract. It shows up in the difficulty of resting without guilt. It shows up in the habit of checking email on a Friday evening when there's no real urgency. It shows up in the feeling that an entire afternoon without producing anything was an afternoon wasted. It shows up in the body that has forgotten what it feels like to just sit still, not processing any task, not gearing up for the next thing, not justifying its own right to take up space. Yet the result is an entire generation that never learned how to inhabit the present. That wakes up in the morning already starting the day in the red, already owing something to someone, already behind on an ideal they never chose for themselves. This is not a coincidence. It's the system working exactly as it was designed. A fish doesn't know it's wet because it's never been out of water. When you understand that your exhaustion has an origin that is, in large part, constructed, that it was installed before you were born, the first thing that happens is a kind of relief, not because the exhaustion disappears, but because you stop blaming yourself for it as if it were a personal failure. There's an idea the marketplace sells efficiently, and most people buy it without realizing. The emptiness is a problem for people who haven't arrived yet. When you have the right job, the feeling will go away. When you have the right relationship, you'll feel whole. When you hit that number in your bank account, that's when life will finally make sense. And while that hasn't happened yet, the logical conclusion the system offers is that you haven't done enough, that the problem is a lack of arrival, not the nature of the destination. Jung cuts right through that with an observation that stings because it's precise. No, that's not how it works. He spent years observing what happened to people when they finally got what they had spent their whole lives chasing. And the pattern repeated. The achievement came. The satisfaction lasted briefly. And then came the emptiness. It's sometimes bigger than before. Because the emptiness wasn't in the absence of achievement. It was in a question that achievement never answers. Jung said there is a moment, sometimes in midlife, sometimes much earlier, When a crisis arrives that no external achievement can resolve. A crisis that asks you to look inward, not outward. To ask not what you have, but who you are. And that moment doesn't arrive as a sign of failure. It arrives as a sign of maturity. That you've gone far enough in the direction the system pointed, and now you need a different map. There's an idea, discussed by 20th century philosophers, that suffering begins the moment a person realizes the world doesn't hold the answer they've spent their whole life looking for. That the rational pursuit of achievement and progress doesn't address the most fundamental question: why am I here, and what does any of this mean? And recognizing that isn't despair. It's the first honest act of someone who stops looking in the wrong place, who stops asking the destination what only the journey can answer. The successful person who wakes up wanting to vanish isn't strange. They're someone who reached the promised destination and discovered the map was wrong. And that discovery, as painful as it is the beginning of something no achievement ever brought. A genuine question about who you are when no one is watching and nothing needs to be delivered. Now, deeper into Jung, into the concept that is perhaps the most important and the most uncomfortable he ever developed: the shadow. It's as simple as this. The shadow is everything you've swept under the rug of your interior. Everything that got repressed because it didn't fit the image you built of yourself, or the image others built of you before you had the words to question what was being placed inside you. The anger that was unacceptable to feel. The grief that had no room. The desire that didn't fit your own story. The parts of you that were marked, explicitly or indirectly, as inappropriate, dangerous, shameful. Everything that was rejected doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow. It stays there. And it grows in the dark. And what makes the shadow so hard to deal with is that it doesn't show up with a label. It surfaces sideways, as a reaction that's wildly out of proportion to a small situation. As a relationship pattern that keeps repeating even when you swore this time would be different. As a self-sabotage that makes no rational sense but happens at the worst possible moments. You react with an intensity that surprises even you. And then you're left trying to figure out where that came from. Jung said something that makes people uncomfortable when they'd rather look outward. The most powerful enemy is often not out there. It's inside. It's the part of you that you refuse to get to know. And it doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It just gets more creative in the ways it shows up. I know that's hard to hear. But part of the weight you carry, part of that nameless tightness, is the accumulated weight of everything that never had space to exist. You're not just carrying your external responsibilities. You're carrying everything that never had room. Everything that was never said, never truly felt. And that kind of exhaustion is something no vacation fixes, because you come home from vacation and the weight came back with you. It's an exhaustion that no promotion reaches, because the promotion doesn't have access to the place where that weight lives. And then comes the moment when the exhaustion stops being a thought and becomes a symptom. It's no longer "I'm tired" as a verbal statement. It's your heart racing for no apparent reason at 3 in the afternoon. It's waking up at 3 a.m. with an anxiety that has no address, a diffuse dread of something you can't name. It's difficulty swallowing before a situation that technically shouldn't feel this threatening. It's your body literally refusing to cooperate, not out of laziness, and because something deeper than conscious will decide it to stop before it was asked to. Jung understood this mechanism. The human interior has its own protection systems. And when they reach their limit, when the accumulated pressure can no longer be ignored, the body takes over communication, not as punishment, as translation. The body says in physical language what the mind refused to admit in words. The problem is that the mind is very good at constructing stories that keep the system running for a little longer. 1 more week, 1 more month. It'll get better after the holidays. When I finish this project, I'll rest. When things settle down, I'll deal with it. And while the mind is busy manufacturing the next justification, the body stores what was never processed. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna didn't stop because he decided the timing was right. His legs simply gave out. The system reached its limit and signaled that in the only way that couldn't be ignored. A collapse is not a character failure. It's the system hitting its limit and asking for attention instead of more demands. And here, before we go any further, there's a necessary pause. If the weight you're carrying goes beyond the kind of exhaustion we've been describing here, if it's heavier than an existential crisis, if it's reached a place where you feel you need help to get through it, that deserves specialized attention. Not because you're weak, but because this kind of weight has treatment and support available. Seeking that out isn't abandoning the inner journey. It's part of it. It's an act of honesty with yourself. There is a kind of silence you've spent your life avoiding. Not the silence between one conversation and the next. The inner silence. The one where no distraction is available. Where it's just you and everything inside you with no way out. Watts observed that the modern human being has filled every available space with noise in a way that has no historical precedent. The notification that arrives before you finished reading the previous one. The scroll that keeps going even when you're no longer absorbing anything. The background playlist. The podcast during the commute. The compulsive phone check before you're fully awake. The video before bed. Not because you actually want to see that specific content, but because the alternative silence feels too heavy. This doesn't happen by accident. It happens because in the silence you come face to face with yourself. And that encounter, when you've spent years avoiding it, tends to be unsettling. In the silence, the unanswered questions surface. The emotions you push down with more work, more commitments, more distractions. The voice that says, with a calm that is somehow disturbing, that something isn't right. Watts said, "Constant busyness is an anesthetic. It's easier to always be doing than to simply be." And most people are so afraid of having nothing to do that they've developed a kind of allergy to their own silence. Jung adds to this, what surfaces in that silence is exactly what the shadow has been holding. Everything you never processed appears when you stop. That's why stopping is scary. That's why real silence, unfilled, unjustified, causes a discomfort that seems out of proportion, but makes complete sense once you understand what's being stored in there. The urge to disappear, that feeling of wanting to vanish, walk away, escape, might actually be a deep desire for genuine silence. Not absence, presence. True presence with yourself, without performance, without noise, without a mask. A space where you don't need to be anything other than what you already are. That need isn't weakness. It's the self asking for room to breathe inside a life that forgot to leave any room for it. Let's return to Arjuna, but this time, deeper. When he sat down on the floor of the war chariot with his bow in his lap, there was someone beside him. Krishna, in the Gita's narrative, Arjuna's spiritual guide, the voice that represents something beyond the ego, and beyond duty, beyond the battle in front of him. And what follows is a dialogue that takes its time. It's not a 2-minute motivational pep talk. It's an honest encounter between a man who collapsed and a presence that doesn't judge him for it. And what Krishna said was not what you'd expect. It wasn't, get up and fight. It wasn't, stop being weak. It wasn't even rest for a while and come back later. Krishna said something radically different. He said, act, but without being a slave to the outcome. This is the core of karma yoga, one of the paths described in the Gita. The central idea is that suffering doesn't come from action itself. It comes from the attachment you create between what you do and who you are. You don't suffer because you work. You suffer because your personal worth is tied to what the work delivers. A presentation that doesn't land isn't just a professional setback. It becomes proof of something about who you are. A missed goal isn't just a data point. It's a verdict on whether you are enough. Think about what it feels like to walk out of a meeting where things didn't go the way you wanted. There's a tightening in the chest, a voice that starts replaying what you should have said differently, what was missing, what everyone else must have thought. That replay isn't rational analysis. It's the ego trying to locate the flaw in order to protect the image. And it drains you, not just from the meeting, from all the time that comes after it. Karma yoga doesn't magically fix that, but it points to where healing becomes possible, in the space between the outcome and the judgment you make about yourself because of it. The outcome happened. What you do with it is a separate question, but the outcome is not who you are. It never was. That equation was installed from the outside, and it can be uninstalled with time and awareness. That attachment between outcome and worth turns everything into a threat. And when everything is a threat, the system stays on permanent high alert. And permanent high alert is exactly the soil where the exhaustion you're feeling takes root and grows. Karma yoga doesn't ask you to stop acting. It asks you to act from a deeper place, not from the part of you that needs approval, but from the self that acts because acting is in your nature. Without the anxiety of the outcome as the measure of who you are, you don't need to resolve this right now. But it's worth knowing that there is a different way to relate to what you build, and that way doesn't require dropping everything. It requires dropping something far more specific than everything. So the escape plan takes shape: a different city, a completely different job, a life with none of the marks of this one. Maybe an island or a cabin in the woods with no internet, or an apartment where nobody knows you and no expectation can reach you. You close your eyes and picture it, and for a moment, your breathing gets easier. Your chest loosens. The anxiety takes a break, and then you open your eyes, and you're in the same place. Watts was blunt about it. You take yourself with you wherever you go. The shadow doesn't have a fear of flying. The patterns you carry don't stay in a drawer while you travel. The part of you that struggles with intimacy will show up in the next relationship running the same script, even if the setting is different. The part that sabotages when you're close to something good will find a way to repeat the pattern, no matter how many miles separate you from the place where it first showed up. Changing your surroundings without understanding what's underneath is rearranging the furniture in a house that still has the same problem in the foundation. The view from the window changes. The smell of a new place is real. The feeling of a fresh start in the first few weeks is genuine. But what was inside is still there, because the place was never the problem. You were, not as blame, but as the location where the change needs to happen. And none of this invalidates real, necessary changes. And sometimes leaving is the right answer. Sometimes changing jobs, cities, or relationships is an honest part of the path, because you've grown and the space no longer fits, not because you're running away. But there's a huge difference between moving because you've become someone larger than your current space can hold, and running because you can't stand what you find when you're still long enough to listen to yourself. The first is movement. The second is an escape that buys a little time before the same weight shows up again with a different backdrop. The Bhagavad Gita makes a distinction that, once you can feel it rather than just understand it, changes the quality of everything that comes after. There is the ego, the part of you that has a name, a history, achievements, fears. That gets worn down. That suffers, and that wants to run when the weight gets to be too much. The ego is real, but it's not all that you are. And there is something deeper. The Gita calls it Atman, the true self, the one that doesn't burn out or collapse, that exists before any version of you that was built over time, and would still exist after every mask had fallen away, after every title had been stripped, after no performance was needed anymore. This distinction isn't just philosophical. It has practical consequences for the way you deal with exhaustion. Because if you believe the ego is all you are, then when the ego collapses, you've collapsed. But if there is something beneath the ego that doesn't collapse, then the collapse is a crisis of the surface, not of the center. It's a storm, not a shipwreck. And Jung arrived at a similar point by a completely different route. Through the interior of the mind, rather than through the philosophy of the Hindu tradition. He called it individuation, the movement toward the deepest center of yourself, behind all the constructed personas, behind the shadow, behind the roles. The slow movement of becoming who you actually are. Not the approved version, not the one built to survive, but the core that was always there before any construction began. When you bring these two perspectives together, the urge to vanish takes on a different dimension. Because when you understand that there is an ego that wants to escape and a self that wants to be heard, the question changes. It stops being, how do I get out? And becomes, what part of me is asking for space it was never given? That question might seem small. It isn't. It's the difference between spending a whole life trying to resolve the discomfort by changing the scenery, and spending a whole life trying to understand where the discomfort comes from. The second is harder. And for that exact reason, it's the only one that leads somewhere you won't need to abandon afterward. Here we arrive at the hardest part. What needs to be said honestly, without romanticizing it, but also without unnecessary cruelty. Real transformation. Not the weekend retreat version, not the self-help version that promises a turnaround in 7 steps, requires real loss. It requires grief. It requires that something which existed stops existing. And that's hard, because the mind doesn't easily distinguish between losing something harmful and losing something beloved. Sometimes they're the same thing. Jung was specific. You cannot become who you truly are without letting go of who you thought you were. Some of the versions of yourself that need to go were built with enormous effort, over years. They cost choices. They cost sacrifices you can't undo. The version that never asks for help because asking was marked as weakness at some point you didn't choose. The version that's always fine because showing otherwise is too dangerous. The version the family chose before you had any say in the matter. The version the marketplace rewards, which may not even be the version you would have chosen if the choice had actually been yours. And these versions weren't wrong to exist. They served a purpose. They protected you at a time when you needed protection. An armor that saved you through one winter makes sense in winter. The problem starts when winter is over, summer has come, and you're still carrying the iron weight because you learned to confuse the armor with your body. Letting go isn't forgetting. It isn't denying that those versions existed or that they cost something. It's recognizing that they've reached the end of what they could do for you, and that holding on to what has already served its purpose doesn't protect you. It just weighs you down. The Gita reinforces this from a spiritual angle. Attachment to what has passed is the root of suffering. And not because the past is bad, but because holding on to what has already fulfilled its purpose prevents the next cycle from beginning. Like trying to plant in ground that's still occupied by a harvest that's already done. So the question this moment raises, the most honest and necessary question in this entire video, isn't, do you want to abandon your life? It's, what exactly do you want to abandon? Your life, or the version of yourself that can no longer survive this version of your life? Those are fundamentally different questions, with fundamentally different paths, and only you know the answer. But it's worth stopping to make the distinction, because that difference changes everything that comes after. There is an in-between that almost no one prepares you to cross. It's the space between who you were and who you haven't become yet. A void between two worlds, where the old version no longer holds, but the new one doesn't have a shape yet. It doesn't have a name. It's not something you can introduce to the world, or even to yourself. Jung described this phase as the darkest period of transformation, comparable to what the medieval alchemists called the leaden phase, the moment when the old material has dissolved, but the new one hasn't taken form yet. No shine, no clarity, just the weight of the in-between. This space is disorienting in a way that's hard to describe to someone who isn't inside it, because you're no longer who you were, but you don't yet know who you're going to be. Decisions that used to be automatic now take an effort you never had to spend before. Uncertainties that supported your routine disappear without warning, and the temptation is enormous. Either to run back to the old version, which is at least familiar, which at least feels like home, even if it no longer fits, or to force a new version before it's genuinely ready. I know it's hard to hear this without wanting to skip to the next part, but you can't. This space is where transformation actually happens. Not at the departure, not at the arrival, in the middle, in transit, in the silence that didn't choose you, but that you somehow chose. The Gita recognizes this in-between with a precision that is striking for a text 3,000 years old. Arjuna didn't stand back up immediately after the collapse. There was no glorious turnaround in 2 minutes. There was silence, a long and attentive listening. Though a dialogue that spans 18 full chapters before the warrior is ready to act again, but differently, transformed. The void is not failure, it's gestation. It's the cocoon, which from the outside looks still, looks dead, but on the inside is in the middle of everything changing. You don't have to force anything right now. You don't have to solve this today. What you need for this moment is to learn how to be in the in-between without destroying yourself inside it. That's already enough. But how do you keep existing while you're in the middle of all this? How do you act, fulfill what needs to be fulfilled, have relationships, work, without being consumed by what you build, without turning every result into a verdict about who you are, without collapsing again before you finished recovering from the last one? And the Gita offers a practical answer, not as a magic recipe, but as an orientation toward action. Karma Yoga, which already came up here, is a guide for how to act while the change is still happening. The core idea is simple to say and hard to live. Commit, give what you have, act. But don't define who you are by the outcome of what you produce. It sounds abstract until you stop to notice what actually happens inside you when something you did doesn't go well. The presentation that didn't land. The project that didn't get the return you expected. The effort that went unrecognized. Where in your body do you feel that? There's a tightening, sometimes in the chest, sometimes in the stomach. And with it comes, almost always, a story about what this says about you. Not just, it didn't work, but I wasn't enough. Karma Yoga is the practice of separating those two things. The result is a data point. Your existence is not a data point. It's something far larger than any deliverable. Watts described this in a way that's hard to forget. He said that life is not a problem to be solved. It's music to be played. When you dance, you're not trying to get somewhere with the dance. The movement is the point. When you play an instrument, you're not trying to finish the song as fast as possible so you can say you played it. You're inside the music while it's happening. Each note has meaning in itself, not as a stepping stone to the next chord. Karma Yoga asks you to approach the actions of your life the same way, not as stepping stones toward an outcome that will finally make you feel like you're enough, as expressions of who you are, right here, while you're doing them. This is not an invitation to ignore goals. It's an invitation to change your relationship with them, so that the path has value in and of itself, not just the destination. And when you manage to do that, even for moments, even imperfectly, the weight shifts in quality. It doesn't disappear, but it stops being crushing, because you've stopped turning every step into a courtroom. Now the three converge, and this time directly, because this is where the journey arrives at its most central point. Jung said, over decades of work, the greatest courage available to a human being is to face their own interior, not the enemies that exist out there. And they do exist. Not the injustices that are real. And they are real. but your own interior. With everything that's stored there, with everything you preferred not to look at because looking hurt more than looking away. That courage isn't about strength. It's about honesty. It's about stopping the habit of outsourcing the cause of your discomfort, placing it on the job, the relationship, the city, and starting to ask, what is it inside me that I still haven't looked at directly? Watts said, "Life is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be lived. And as long as you treat every moment as an obstacle on the way to the next one, you'll never truly inhabit your own existence. You'll always be in transit, always arriving, never arrived, always in the before or the after, never in the now." Watts observed that most people act as if life were a rehearsal for a play that never begins. You prepare, you organize, and you wait for the right moment. And the right moment never comes because the present never seems sufficiently ready to be the present you wanted. The Gita said 3,000 years ago, Arjuna's battlefield was internal before it was external. The armies were real, the battle was real. But the decisive transformation happened inside the war chariot, in the silence between the collapse and the action. It was there, in that space no one else witnessed, that Arjuna stopped being who he was and began to become who he needed to be. All three point to the same place. Transformation doesn't happen when you find the right environment or the perfect circumstance. It doesn't happen when life finally stops demanding so much. It happens when you stop running from what's chasing you and decide to turn around and face what's been following you all along. And what is following you? It's the question that, deep down, you already sense the answer to. It's the part of you that never had space to exist. It's the self that sits beneath all the masks, waiting in silence to be recognized. It's what surfaces in moments of real stillness, and that you quickly drown out with more noise so you don't have to stay with it for very long. But what if you stayed? Not to fix it, not to analyze it, just to be with it, for a moment longer than the discomfort urges you to run. It's in that exact moment, right then, that the most important thing begins to happen. Not out there, inside. You've always known where the answer was. You just haven't given yourself permission to look yet. If you're enjoying this content, check out in the first comment our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes, because what we explored here goes far beyond a single video. And that material was built for those who want to continue this journey with real depth. So here we are at the end, but not a neatly packaged conclusion, because what was said here doesn't fit in a clean box. The desire to drop everything is real. It's valid, human at the deepest possible level, and it deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed as ingratitude, not glorified as enlightenment, not managed with ready-made solutions that ignore what's actually being asked. It points inward, always inward. Jung called it individuation, the movement of becoming who you truly are. Not the version approved by your environment, not the one built to be accepted, but the version that carries the shadows along with it, that doesn't run from its own contradictions, that makes room for everything that was silenced by force and still needs light. That movement doesn't end with a video, a retreat, or a book. It's the work of an entire lifetime. Slow, uncomfortable, and sometimes surprisingly beautiful when you pause to notice how much you've changed without realizing it. Individuation has no completion date, no certificate. There's no way to know when you've arrived because the destination is a direction, not an address. But there is a way to know when you're on the path, when you start acting from something deeper than the fear of being rejected, and the exhaustion you feel begins to have a name. The Gita calls it Dharma, the unique path that only you can walk. Not the one your family chose, not the one the marketplace rewards best, the one that emerges from who you are when you stop performing and simply start being, when the loudest voice stops being the voice of external expectations and begins to be the voice of the self that has always been waiting to be heard. That path is not more comfortable than what you've been doing. It's more honest. And honesty, even when it hurts, carries a kind of lightness that performance will never have. Watts reminds us, with a gentleness that sometimes hides just how radical the observation really is. You already are what you're looking for. The feeling of incompleteness isn't a sign that something is missing that hasn't arrived yet. It's a sign that you've lost contact with what's already there. The search isn't for something new. It's a return, a reunion with something that wasn't created. That was simply forgotten beneath many layers of performance, fear, and approval bought at a steep price. Disappearing isn't the answer. Becoming is. And that movement, that slow, often invisible to the outside world process of becoming who you truly are, has already begun. It began at the exact moment you stopped to listen. At the instant something in you said, enough. Not of everything, of a version of everything that no longer fits. Thank you for being here. Until next time.